When an empire that devours galaxies tears through the sky above Earth, hope learns the taste of ashes. Their ships block out the sun, and their prayers are written in the language of extinction. Superman has saved the world 1,000 times, but never from saviors who burn planets to purify them. Can compassion survive when it faces an empire that calls mercy a disease? The sky above Metropolis had been cloudless that morning, a perfect cerulean dome, unmarred by weather or shadow. Office workers sipped their coffee on balconies overlooking the bay. Children pointed at the distant glint of daily planet globes spinning lazily in the autumn sun. The city hummed with the mundane rhythm of a Thursday, predictable and safe, the kind of ordinary peace that belonged to a world protected by gods who wore capes and smiled for cameras. Then reality tore open like parchment held too close to flame. The first sign was not visual but auditory, a low thrum that resonated in bone marrow and dental fillings, a frequency that made pigeons drop from their perches and car alarms wail in discordant chorus. Scientists at STAR Labs would later describe it as a dimensional frequency collapse, a harmonic cascade that should have been mathematically impossible. Philosophers would call it the moment optimism learned to scream. The tear manifested 3 miles above Metropolis Harbor, a wound in the fabric of space itself that bled colors no human eye was meant to process. Crimson and violet, and a sickly green that seemed to writhe with malevolent sentience, all folding in upon themselves in geometries that hurt to perceive. The edges of the rift crackled with energies that made the air itself convulse, distorting light and gravity in concentric waves that sent seabirds spiraling toward the waves below. And then the fleet emerged. They came through in procession, vast cathedral ships of Gothic majesty and brutal function, each one a mountain of adamantium and faith rendered mobile. The lead vessel was a battle barge of the Adeptus Astartes, its prow shaped like a screaming eagle with wings spread wide enough to shadow city blocks. Behind it came cruisers and destroyers, troop carriers and forge tenders, munitions, barges and penitent haulers, all bearing the iconography of the Imperium of Man rendered in gold leaf and human bone. Gargoyles the size of houses leered from buttresses. Stained glass windows 50 meters tall depicted saints crushing Xenos beneath armored boots. Gun batteries lined flanks in rows so numerous they resembled the scales of some primordial dragon. The Iron Talon Crusade fleet had translated from the immaterium into real space, and they had brought the Emperor's judgment with them. On the bridge of the unrelenting righteousness, Lord Solar Adrastus Kalor stood before the Oculus viewport and surveyed the world below with eyes the color of glacial ice. He was a man who had never known youth, his face carved by decades of warfare into something resembling a heroic statue weathered by acid rain. Augmetic implants traced silver lines across his scalp where his skull had been rebuilt after a greenskin's axe had tried to introduce his brain to the open air. His armor was a masterwork of Martian artificers, Terminator plate enameled in white and crimson, each surface etched with prayers of hatred in high Gothic script, small enough to require magnification to read. He had served the Golden Throne for 73 years. He had overseen the compliance of 19 worlds. He had executed 7 planetary governors for insufficient zeal and 3 Lord Militants for excessive mercy. He looked upon Earth and saw only another world in need of salvation through subjugation. "Augur readings," he commanded, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who had inhaled too much promethium smoke and found he preferred the taste to water. A tech priest scuttled forward, more machine than man, the biological components of his face reduced to a single eye and a slack jaw wired to vox amplifiers. Binary cant chittered from his vocabulator before his remaining organic parts translated into Low Gothic. Verification protocols confirm M-class world, Lord Solar. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere within tolerable parameters, gravity 0.987 standard. Population density indicates hive-scale civilization, though architecture suggests primitive industrial revolution aesthetic maintained for cultural purposes. Heretic affectation, muttered Commander Thaddeus Gryle, captain of the Crimson Castellans chapter assigned to the Crusade. His armor was the deep red of arterial spray, decorated with purity seals that whispered prayers in the stale recycled air. They build false antiquity to hide technological regression. I have seen it before on Proxima Malthus. Kaelor nodded slowly. Scan for Mechanicus broadcast protocols. If they possess standard template construct archives, we are obligated to secure them for Mars. The tech priest's mechadendrites twitched as he interfaced with the ship's auger arrays. Moments passed, counted only by the rhythmic hiss of the bridge's atmospheric processors. When he spoke again, his biological eye had dilated with something approaching horror. No Mechanicum signatures detected. No astropathic choir presence. No administratum tax assessment beacons. No ecclesiarchy cathedra spires. The vocabulator crackled with something that might have been confusion in a creature still capable of the emotion. They do not appear to know the Imperium exists. The bridge fell silent, save for the omnipresent hum of plasma conduits and the distant thrum of Geller field generators still cycling down from warp translation. Every officer present understood the implication. A human world, technologically advanced, ignorant of the Emperor's light. Lost colony, heretic deviation, compliance situation. Any evidence of Xenos infiltration or chaos taint? Kaelor's question was perfunctory. He already knew what protocols demanded. Inconclusive, Lord Solar. Detecting significant anomalous energy signatures across the planetary surface. Entities registering power outputs equivalent to Titangen-class war engines, yet mobile and unshielded. Recommend immediate threat assessment and preliminary orbital bombardment of concentrations exceeding acceptable variance. Kaelor turned from the viewport to face his assembled commanders, 3 Astartes captains in their various chapter colors, their gene-forged bulk making even the spacious bridge feel confined. 2 commissars in their long coats and peaked caps, hands never far from bolt pistols. An inquisitorial observer, her face hidden behind a mirrored mask, her presence a reminder that the crusade operated under the distant scrutiny of the Ordos. A Munitorum logistics coordinator whose augmetic implants had replaced most of his brain with calculation engines that could determine ammunition requirements for a 3-year siege in under 6 seconds. They were the instruments of the Imperium's will, each one a lifetime of conditioning and indoctrination rendered flesh. Standing compliance protocols, Kaelor announced, and every person present straightened fractionally. Herald Vox broadcasts on all frequencies. Demand immediate surrender and transition to Imperial governance. Inform the population that they have been separated from the Imperium by warp anomaly and their reconnection is cause for rejoicing. They will be taxed, tithed, and their youth conscripted into Imperial service as is proper and just. They will accept Ministorum oversight and Mechanicus technology audits. And if they refuse compliance, this from one of the commissars, a woman whose face suggested she had personally executed more soldiers for cowardice than most generals commanded in a lifetime. Kaelor's expression did not change. Then we remind them that the Emperor's mercy is finite, and his patience shorter still. The broadcasts began immediately, cutting across every frequency band Earth's communication infrastructure possessed. Radio, television, internet, satellite uplinks, even primitive emergency broadcast systems crackled to life, with the same message repeated in High Gothic, Low Gothic, and a dozen other languages the fleet's cogitators deemed statistically likely to achieve comprehension. Citizens of this world, you have been found. Your ancestors fled the light of the Astronomicon generations past, whether through cowardice or calamity. The Imperium has not forgotten you. The God Emperor's gaze falls upon you once more, and his judgment is absolute. You will submit to compliance protocols immediately. You will acknowledge Imperial authority. You will surrender all technology for Mechanicus audit. You will deliver 1 in 10 of your population for military conscription. You will accept ecclesiarchy missionaries to purge whatever corrupted faiths you have developed in isolation. Resistance is heresy. Heresy is punishable by death. Cooperation will be rewarded with continued existence. You have 1 solar hour to broadcast total surrender. Failure to comply will necessitate aggressive compliance actions. The Emperor protects. He also destroys. The message cycled on infinite repeat. each iteration accompanied by vid captures of previous compliances, worlds burning beneath orbital batteries, population centers reduced to glass, armies marching in perfect lockstep beneath Aquila banners large enough to be seen from low orbit. In Metropolis, people stopped walking. They stood on sidewalks and stared at screens gone haywire, at phones broadcasting impossible proclamations, at the sky where titanic ships floated like Gothic cathedrals torn free from terrestrial gravity. Parents pulled children close. Drivers abandoned cars in the middle of intersections. Police officers stared at each other with expressions that recognized the situation had escalated far beyond their jurisdictional training. In Washington, the president was being hustled into bunkers, while Joint Chiefs frantically tried to determine if this was an elaborate hoax or if the laws of physics had just taken early retirement. In the Watchtower, the Justice League had already assembled, staring at holographic displays that showed ships too large to have launched from Earth's surface, too numerous to have approached without detection. And in Metropolis, standing on the roof of the Daily Planet building still wearing the civilian clothes of Clark Kent, Superman heard the message and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had encountered threats before. Alien invasions, interdimensional conquerors, gods and demons, and time-traveling warlords. He had faced beings that could crack continents and entities that fed on cosmic entropy. But this felt different. The sheer scale of the fleet, the cold bureaucratic certainty in that message, the casual mention of conscription and execution as administrative necessity, these were not conquerors seeking personal glory or cosmic tyrants demanding worship. These were soldiers following protocols refined over millennia, implementing compliance procedures with the same emotional investment a factory worker might bring to an assembly line. They intended to burn his world because a manual told them to, and they would feel nothing doing it. Superman's jaw tightened. His eyes tracked the ships, arranging themselves in orbital formation, calculating tonnage and probable weapons yields, estimating civilian casualties if even one of those vessels opened fire on the city below. 1 hour, the message had said. He glanced at his watch. 58 minutes remaining. Then he stepped off the roof and let gravity claim him for exactly 3 seconds before his flight kicked in and he was accelerating skyward, a blue and red blur cutting through the autumn air, faster than sound, faster than comprehension, climbing toward the wounded sky, where ships of nightmare and prayer waited with guns already warming. The war had not yet begun, but the prelude was already written in the cold mathematics of orbital bombardment patterns and the warm certainty that some battles cannot be avoided, only endured. Metropolis held its breath. The fleet waited, and Superman rose to meet them, alone against an armada, hope incarnate facing doctrine absolute. The sky was about to learn what happened when mythology and methodology collided at terminal velocity. Superman breached the cloud layer at Mach 5, moisture condensing into vapor trails that spiraled behind him like the wake of a divine vessel cutting through mortal seas. The air temperature dropped precipitously as he climbed, frost forming on his cape in crystalline patterns that shattered and reformed with each second of ascent. Below, Metropolis had become a toy model, streets reduced to grid lines, buildings to geometric abstractions. Ahead, the fleet loomed larger with each kilometer gained, resolving from distant shapes into cathedral mountains of steel and faith. He had crossed into the thermosphere when the first weapon lock occurred. On the unrelenting righteousness, an augur servitor's dead eyes snapped wide, the biological portions of its brain screaming chemical warnings to its cybernetic components. Target lock, it chittered in binary. Single entity, ascending at impossible velocity, no detectable propulsion signature, threat assessment critical. Commander Grail stepped forward, his armor's autosenses interfacing with the bridge's tactical display. A hololithic projection materialized above the command throne, showing Superman rendered in wireframe geometry and threat-level gradients that climbed from amber to crimson as the system struggled to classify what its sensors were reporting. "By the throne," whispered a junior officer, immediately making the sign of the Aquila and muttering a prayer of protection. "Mass equivalent to unarmored human," the tech priest reported, his vocabulator struggling with the cognitive dissonance of his instruments. velocity exceeding atmospheric fighter craft, energy signature minimal, no visible mechanical augmentation, no warp taint detected. A pause, crackling with static. Biological readings suggest baseline human physiology with anomalous cellular density. Mutant, Grail pronounced, his voice flat with certainty. Gene curse, perhaps Xenos hybrid contamination. Negative warp resonance. This is not word-born power, this is something else. Lord Solar Kalor rose from his command throne, his Terminator armor hissing with pneumatic force. He had encountered many Xenos in his decades of service. Orcs whose muscles could tear open tank armor, Eldar who moved like quicksilver hallucinations, Tyranid bioforms bred specifically to counter Imperial war doctrine. But a human, unaugmented by visible technology, ascending toward a battle fleet alone, either supreme arrogance or supreme capability. In his experience, the former usually died screaming, while the latter required orbital bombardment to suppress. Weapons authorization. Threshold level 1, he commanded. Target the approaching entity. Fire solution. Lance strikes. Converging pattern. If it survives the first salvo, upgrade to macro cannon barrage. Lord Solar, the inquisitorial observer, stepped forward, her voice modulated by vox distortion to sound neither male nor female, neither young nor old. Perhaps we should attempt communication first. If this is a planetary defense coordinator, killing them immediately may complicate compliance negotiations. Kalor's expression suggested he found compliance negotiations approximately as valuable as a guardsman's opinion on battle strategy. They were given 1 hour to surrender. Approaching an Imperial fleet in a manner suggesting hostile intent constitutes refusal of compliance. We respond as doctrine dictates. The observer inclined her head fractionally, a gesture that could mean agreement or simply acknowledgement that she had made her objection formally for the records. The Inquisition would review all actions post-compliance. Best to have one's dissenting opinions logged. Fire, Kalor ordered. The Unrelenting Righteousness was a warship built in the orbital foundries above Mars 3,000 years prior, its keel blessed by a fabricator general whose name was now lost to archival decay. Its lance batteries were miracles of directed energy physics, each one capable of carving through void shields and adamantium plating with equal contempt for material resistance. When they fired, they did so in perfect synchronization. 6 beams of coherent light, each carrying enough energy to vaporize a city block, converging on a single point in space, where Superman would be in exactly 3 seconds. Superman saw the weapons charging a full second before they fired, his vision tracking the energy buildup in what his mind perceived as a slow-motion cascade of gathering destruction. Heat bloom visible across the electromagnetic spectrum. Coolant systems cycling. Capacitor discharge. The universe gave warnings if you knew how to read them, and Kryptonian eyes could read syllables written in quarks. He twisted mid-flight, a maneuver that would have snapped a human spine into 17 pieces, and the lance beams converged on empty air. The beams continued past him, bleeding off into the void beyond Earth's gravity well, carrying enough energy that satellites in adjacent orbits would report anomalous radiation spikes for the next 6 hours. On the bridge, the auger servitor chittered alarm protocols. Target evaded. Probability of successful evasion calculated at 0.003%. Threat assessment upgraded to catastrophic. Impossible, someone whispered, then immediately regretted speaking when Commissar Holt turned her flat gaze in his direction. Superman adjusted his trajectory, angling toward the largest vessel, the one his eyes could identify as the command ship based on the density of communication transmissions it was receiving and broadcasting. He needed to speak with whoever was in charge, needed to make them understand that Earth was not their enemy, that whatever their mission entailed, it could be resolved without bloodshed. He wanted to believe that. Needed to believe that, because the alternative was a conflict that would rain fire on the city below, and he had sworn an oath the day he first donned the cape that Metropolis would never burn while he still drew breath. The fleet opened fire properly. Macro cannons spoke with voices of ancient thunder, projectiles the size of shipping containers, accelerating to hypersonic velocities, each shell carved with prayers of destruction and blessed by Mechanicus priests during their fabrication. Missile batteries released swarms of warheads, hundreds of them, each equipped with guidance systems that could track targets through void shield interference and warp shadow distortion. Point defense turrets added their voices to the chorus, creating a lattice of tracer fire that turned the space between Superman and the fleet into a storm of tungsten and faith. Superman flew through it. He weaved between macro cannon rounds, his velocity shifting in patterns that looked random but were actually calculated probability collapses, occupying positions that weapons officers had designated as statistically least likely. Missiles detonated around him, nuclear yields that would have sterilized square kilometers of surface area, reduced to spheres of superheated plasma that he treated as minor navigational hazards. When point defense rounds did connect, they ricocheted off skin that had evolved under a red sun and transformed under a yellow one into something that treated physics as a polite suggestion. A missile exploded close enough that the shockwave caught him. A tactical nuke with a yield measured in kilotons. The fireball expanded in the fraction of atmosphere present at this altitude, a miniature sun born and dying in the same second. Superman emerged from the far side with his cape singed and his jaw set harder. He had not retaliated, had not struck back. Every instinct told him that responding with violence would only escalate a situation already teetering on the edge of catastrophe. These people thought they were righteous, thought they were saving humanity from some perceived corruption. Hitting them would only confirm whatever assumptions they had made. But his restraint was being tested with thermonuclear authority. Commander Grail watched the tactical display with something approaching religious awe. No void shields, no visible armor, no evasive craft that he could identify beyond raw velocity and spatial awareness that suggested either precognition or reaction times measured in milliseconds. The entity, he was no longer willing to call it human, had just survived a barrage that would have crippled a frigate. "Increase fire density," he commanded. "Pattern Gamma 7, overlapping fields. Leave no evasion corridors." "Commander," the tech priest interjected, "ammunition expenditure already exceeding projected requirements for this compliance action. If the entity continues to evade, then we have confirmation this world harbors threats requiring exterminatus consideration." Grail snapped. "Continue firing." Superman was 300 meters from the unrelenting righteousness when the ship's void shields activated. He felt them before he saw them, a crackling field of energy that created a barrier between real space and a pocket dimension where projectiles and energy weapons would be shunted fractionally out of phase with reality. Sophisticated technology, far beyond anything he had seen deployed in Earth's atmosphere. He slowed his approach, hovering just beyond the shield's perimeter, and for the first time since ascending, he spoke. His voice carried across radio frequencies, a measured tone with just enough volume to be heard clearly over the static of energy weapons discharge and the thrum of capital ship reactors. "I'm here to talk," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "You've made demands that Earth cannot meet. We're not part of your Imperium. We don't recognize your authority, but we don't want war. Let me speak with your commander. We can resolve this peacefully." The response came in the form of a boarding torpedo. It launched from an assault bay on the unrelenting Righteousness's port flank, an armored cylinder 40 meters long driven by a fusion engine designed for one purpose: punching through enemy ship hulls and delivering Space Marines directly into close-quarters combat. They had repurposed it as an anti-entity weapon, filling the interior with servitors equipped with heavy bolters and frag grenades, turning it into a kinetic missile with teeth. The torpedo's guidance system locked onto Superman with mechanical certainty. Its engine flared, and it accelerated with enough force that the G-forces would have reduced unaugmented humans to organic paste against the rear bulkhead. Superman caught it. His hands impacted the torpedo's nose cone at a combined velocity that should have resulted in a spectacular explosion. Instead, Superman arrested its momentum in the span of 3 meters, friction with the atmosphere creating a wake of superheated air that glowed orange-white. Metal screamed, rivets sheared, The torpedo's engine continued to fire, trying desperately to overcome the impossible resistance, fuel consumption spiking to critical levels. Then Superman rotated, twisting in the air with the torpedo held like an unwieldy spear, and hurled it back toward the fleet with precisely calibrated force. Not at the unrelenting righteousness. He was not trying to kill anyone. He aimed for empty space adjacent to one of the smaller escort vessels, sending the torpedo tumbling past its bow close enough that its proximity alarms would scream, but far enough that no collision would occur. A warning shot. A demonstration. "I could hurt you," the gesture said, "but I'm choosing not to." On the bridge, Lord Solar Kalor watched the return torpedo spiral past the destroyer Righteous Fury and understood the message perfectly. His expression did not change, but his grip on his power sword's hilt tightened fractionally. "Deploy the Astartes," he said quietly. "Full tactical squad, Terminator armor. I want that thing captured for inquisitorial examination or destroyed. I will accept either outcome." Commander Grail inclined his head, already activating Vox channels to the Crimson Castellan's battle barge. "It will be done, Lord Solar." The Astartes deployment was a ritual as old as the Imperium itself. In the battle barge's arming chamber, 10 Space Marines of the Crimson Castellan's chapter stood in silence as servitors and tech priests performed pre-combat rites. Each warrior was a genetic masterwork, organs implanted over years of surgery and hypno-conditioning that had transformed them from human boys into post-human weapons. Their Terminator armor was ancient, relic-grade equipment that had survived 10,000 years of warfare, blessed by chaplains and anointed with oils rendered from saints' bones. Brother Sergeant Tyrion stood at the center of the formation, his armor's helmet interface feeding him tactical data directly into his brain via haptic impulses, 2 hearts beating in perfect synchronization, 3 lungs filtering the recycled air, omophagia gland processing combat stimulants that would send a baseline human into cardiac arrest. He was bred for war, trained for war, psycho-conditioned to embrace war as the highest calling of humanity. He recited the litany of hatred as the armorer servitors sealed his helmet, his voice modulated by Vox grills into a resonant growl. "Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. Blessed is the bolt that flies true. Blessed is the enemy who stands before me, for in his destruction I serve the Emperor's will." 10 Astartes, each one a walking tank capable of tearing through concrete with bare hands, armed with storm bolters and power fists, chain axes and melter bombs. They boarded drop pods, brutal cylinders designed to survive atmospheric entry at terminal velocity, and launched. Superman saw them coming, 5 meteors burning through the upper atmosphere, retro thrusters firing in controlled bursts to slow descent vectors. He hovered, waiting, hoping that whoever was inside would be willing to listen where weapons had not. The drop pods impacted the industrial district of Metropolis with enough force to crater asphalt and shatter windows in a 3-block radius. Explosive bolts detonated, blowing the pod's hatches outward in controlled demolitions. And then the Astartes emerged, 10 giants in crimson plate, each one standing over 7 feet tall in armor that added another 1.5 feet of ceramite and adamantium. Brother Sergeant Tyrion's auto-senses immediately locked onto Superman, hovering 60 meters above the street, cape rippling in winds generated by the drop pod's landings. Tyrion accessed the tactical data uplinked from the fleet, reviewing the entity's performance against fleet weapons. Threat level maximized. Lethality probability extreme. Engagement authorization total. Target acquired, he voxed to his squad. Hostility confirmed by evasion of compliance fire. Purge protocols active. Superman descended slowly, hands raised in a gesture of peaceful intent that transcended language and culture. "I don't want to fight you," he called out, his voice carrying clearly despite the sounds of car alarms and distant screams. "People are terrified. You're making this worse. Talk to me. Tell me what you want." Tyrion responded by raising his storm bolter and opening fire. The weapon was a masterpiece of Martian engineering, capable of firing self-propelled mass-reactive rounds at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. Each bolt was a miniature rocket containing a shaped charge designed to penetrate armor before detonating internally, turning flesh and bone into soup and shrapnel. Against orcs, they exploded heads like overripe melons. Against Eldar, they punched through energy fields and gossamer armor with contemptuous ease. Against Superman, they ricocheted. The bolts struck his chest, his shoulders, his face, each impact creating a brief spark where kinetic energy met invulnerable biology. They bounced away at wild angles, several of them detonating mid-air after their guidance systems lost lock, creating a staccato percussion of explosions that echoed through the urban canyon of office buildings and apartments. Tyrion's centuries of combat experience processed this information in fractions of a second. Invulnerable to small arms, upgrading response. Melter protocol, he commanded, and 2 of his squad members stepped forward with weapons that glowed with barely contained fusion heat. The melter guns fired, projecting streams of subatomic agitation that could reduce tank armor to molten slag in seconds. The air between the Astartes and Superman turned to plasma, a sun-bright column of heat that reached temperatures exceeding those found in stellar cores. Superman felt it as a mild warmth. He stepped through the beams, his cape disintegrating completely, the undersuit of his costume showing scorch marks but his skin beneath remaining unmarred. Kryptonian cells absorbed radiation, converted it, used it. These weapons were just feeding him energy, making him stronger with every second of exposure. The Astartes recognized this immediately. Tyrion's tactical systems began generating new combat solutions, cycling through weapon permutations and attack patterns, searching for something, anything that would register as a vulnerability. The data came back with a single assessment. Threat equivalent to Greater Daemon manifestation. Recommend full tactical withdrawal and orbital bombardment. Tyrion ignored the recommendation. Space Marines did not withdraw. Space Marines did not surrender. They knew no fear, felt no doubt, accepted no defeat. It was conditioned into them at the genetic level, burned into their psyche through hypno-indoctrination that made cowardice literally impossible to conceptualize. Close combat pattern, he ordered. If ranged weapons fail, we purge with blade and fist. The Astartes charged. 10 post-human warriors, each one a master of warfare with centuries of experience, moving with shocking speed for their size. Servo motors whined, armor plates flexed, chain weapons screamed to life, their teeth spinning at velocities measured in thousands of rotations per minute. Superman met them not with violence but with restraint. The first Astartes to reach him swung a power fist, a massive gauntlet crackling with disruptor fields that could atomize molecular bonds on contact. Superman caught the fist in his palm, metal shrieking as it crumpled, servo motors burning out as they tried to force motion against immovable resistance. With his other hand, Superman grabbed the warrior's chest plate and lifted, hoisting 2 tons of armor and gene-forged muscle overhead before setting him down, gently, on a nearby parked car. The car's frame buckled under the weight. The Astartes scrambled to rise, his pride wounded more than his body. Brother Tyrion came next, his chain axe swinging in an arc, calculated to bisect Superman at the waist. Superman caught the blade between 2 fingers, the spinning teeth throwing sparks as they failed to penetrate his skin. He looked directly into Tyrion's helmet lenses, searching for some sign of humanity beneath the armor and augmentation. "Stop," Superman said, and there was no anger in his voice, only profound sadness. "You don't have to do this." Tyrion's response was to activate his armor's combat stims, flooding his bloodstream with adrenaline analogs and rage-inducing chemicals. He released the axe, letting Superman hold it, and drove his armored knee toward Superman's midsection with enough force to dent tank armor. Superman absorbed the impact without moving, then reached out with movements too fast for even Astartes' auto-senses to fully track. He grabbed each warrior not to hurt them but to stop them, his hands gentle despite the forces involved, lifting and separating and placing them down in positions where they could not immediately re-engage. It was a battle fought with restraint as a weapon, mercy deployed tactically. Superman was trying to prove a point, trying to demonstrate that he was not the enemy they assumed, that violence was a choice rather than an inevitability. But for the Astartes, mercy was incomprehensible. They had been taught that mercy was weakness, that compassion was corruption, that anything less than total commitment to the Emperor's will was heresy wearing a sympathetic face. They regrouped and came at him again and again and again, and each time Superman stopped them without breaking bone or tearing armor. He was trying to save them from themselves, trying to make them understand that this world was not their enemy. High above, aboard the unrelenting righteousness, Lord Solar Kalor watched the combat feed with eyes that had witnessed countless battles and learned to read them like text. He saw his Astartes, the Emperor's finest, being systematically neutralized by an entity that refused to kill despite having demonstrated the capability to do so. Capability with restraint, power with mercy, strength with compassion. Everything the Imperium had spent 10,000 years conditioning out of its warriors, this creature possessed in abundance. Assessment, he demanded. The entity is deliberately non-lethal, Commander Grail reported, his voice tight with incomprehension. It is choosing to incapacitate rather than kill. Why? Unknown. Tactical logic suggests it is attempting to minimize casualties, possibly to facilitate future compliance negotiations. Kalor was silent for 3 seconds, which for a Lord Solar constituted deep contemplation. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had made tens of thousands of decisions that resulted in millions of deaths and never lost a night's sleep. The entity is a threat we cannot neutralize through conventional means. Its restraint suggests sophistication, which implies it may be a leader or coordinator of planetary defense. Capturing or killing it would decapitate their command structure. He turned to face the weapons officer. Prepare cyclonic torpedoes. Target the engagement zone. The bridge fell silent. Even in an Imperium characterized by its casual brutality, cyclonic torpedoes represented a line most commanders hesitated to cross. They were world killers, fusion-enhanced warheads capable of cracking tectonic plates and turning atmospheres into fire. Deploying them on a world marked for compliance was tantamount to declaring the entire effort a failure, the population beyond redemption. Lord Solar, the inquisitorial observer, stepped forward. Cyclonic weapons in an urban center will result in casualties measured in millions. The administratum will require justification. The justification is operational necessity, Kalor interrupted. We are facing an unknown threat that has demonstrated the capacity to resist assault-grade weapons and neutralize Astartes combat teams. Allowing such an entity to remain active while we attempt compliance of the broader population represents an unacceptable risk. We eliminate the aberration now, then proceed with standard pacification of the surviving population centers. The collateral damage is acceptable. Kalor's tone allowed no argument. The Emperor's mercy is reserved for the faithful. These people have had their hour to surrender. They have responded with a superhuman defender and continued resistance. They will learn that the Imperium's patience has limits, and those limits are measured in megatons. The weapons officer began the activation sequence, his hands moving through a series of confirmation rituals that required 3 separate authorization codes and a blood sample verification. Cyclonic torpedoes were kept under lock and prayer, their use requiring the direct approval of command-level authority and the acknowledgement that the souls destroyed by their detonation would weigh upon the officer's conscience unto death. For a man like Lord Solar Kalor, that weight was bearable. He had burned worlds before. He would burn worlds again. It was the duty of the righteous to purge the unworthy, and personal comfort in that duty was irrelevant to its necessity. The torpedoes loaded into launch tubes with mechanical finality. Blessed by chaplains during their manufacture, each warhead carried inscriptions declaring the purity of its purpose, the righteousness of its deployment, the necessity of its fire. In Metropolis, Superman was still attempting to reason with the Astartes, his voice calm despite the absurdity of trying to negotiate while fending off attacks from warriors who viewed negotiation as a form of cowardice. He had not struck a single lethal blow, had not allowed his frustration to manifest as violence, had maintained the principles that defined him even as they were tested by ceramite fists and chain weapon teeth. He was so focused on the immediate threat that he did not see the torpedoes launch until they had already entered the atmosphere. But when he looked up and saw them, 4 streaks of fire descending with the certainty of divine judgment, his expression changed. The hope drained from his face like water from a broken vessel, replaced by something harder, something colder, something that suggested the universe had just used up its allotment of his mercy. He had tried. God and humanity witness, he had tried. Now he would have to do something else. The sky was falling, and Superman rose to catch it, knowing that what came next would not be a conversation but a calculation, not diplomacy but mathematics, not hope, but the cold equation of how many lives he could save measured against how much force he was willing to deploy. The answer formed in his mind with crystal clarity and infinite regret. All of them. Whatever it takes. Superman exploded skyward with enough velocity that the sonic boom shattered windows for 6 blocks and triggered car alarms in a cascading wave of mechanical panic. The Astartes staggered from the pressure wave, their armor's auto-balance systems straining to keep them upright against winds that tried to peel them from the asphalt. Brother Sergeant Tyrion looked up in time to see Superman become a blue and red streak, already several kilometers high, climbing toward the falling torpedoes with acceleration that would have rendered any unprotected human into a thin red mist distributed across several square miles. The cyclonic torpedoes descended on pillars of fire, their guidance systems locked onto Metropolis with the certainty of divine judgment rendered mechanical. Each warhead was a cylinder 20 meters long, packed with fusion charges designed to trigger simultaneous detonations at specific depths, creating shockwaves that would propagate through tectonic layers and turn the city into a caldera. They were weapons meant for worlds that had exhausted the Imperium's patience, for populations that had chosen damnation over compliance, for cities that needed to be erased so thoroughly that only radiation and glass would remain as evidence they had ever existed. Superman reached the first torpedo at 40,000 meters, his hands closing around its warhead casing with fingers that dented adamantium alloy. The torpedo's machine spirit registered the interference, its crude cogitation systems interpreting the sudden deceleration as critical malfunction. It tried to detonate early, fusion triggers initiating pre-ignition sequence. Superman tore the warhead in half. His hands ripped through blast shielding and detonation mechanisms with the same ease a human might tear paper, exposing the torpedo's fusion core to the thin atmosphere. The chain reaction began. Atoms collapsing, energy releasing, the birth of a miniature sun at altitude. Superman took the explosion point blank. The fireball expanded in a sphere of superheated plasma, temperatures sufficient to vaporize steel and turn stone to vapor. It caught Superman at its epicenter, a yield measured in kilotons washing over him in a wave of light and fury. The shockwave rolled outward, rattling satellites and triggering radiation alarms on the International Space Station. Debris from the torpedo's casing became shrapnel, molten metal droplets raining down in a brief meteor shower. When the light faded, Superman remained, hovering in the exact position he had occupied before the blast, his suit scorched black, but his body unharmed. He had absorbed the explosion like a solar panel facing the dawn, Kryptonian cells converting radiation into energy, storing it, banking it for future use. 3 torpedoes remained. He accelerated toward the second, covering the distance in heartbeats, but this one had adjusted its trajectory mid-descent, its guidance system programmed with evasive subroutines designed to counter anti-munitions fire. It jinked left, then dove hard, using gravity and thrust to build velocity, trying to reach terminal velocity before Superman could intercept. Superman matched its vector change instantaneously, his flight path adjusting with the fluid grace of thought made manifest. He came up beneath the torpedo, flying inverted, his back to the earth and his eyes tracking the weapon's spiraling descent. He reached up, grabbed its tail section, and arrested its momentum with a deceleration so sudden that internal components sheared from their mounting brackets, cascading failures rippling through the torpedo's systems. The warhead armed anyway. 2-second fuse, fail-safe detonation. Superman made a decision measured in fractions of thought. He accelerated straight up, carrying the torpedo away from the Earth at speeds that turned the atmosphere into a blur of color and force. 30,000 meters, 40,000, 50,000, the sky darkened from blue to black as he climbed past the Kármán line, into the void where air became suggestion and gravity loosened its grip. The torpedo detonated. The explosion was visible from the ground as a new star blooming against the darkness of space, a sphere of nuclear fire that painted the watchtower's exterior sensors white with electromagnetic radiation. In orbit, pieces of satellites adjusted their trajectories to avoid the expanding debris field. Superman rode the shockwave down, using it to slingshot himself toward the remaining two torpedoes, which had split their trajectories, one targeting downtown Metropolis, the other angling toward the harbor district where population density would maximize casualties. He couldn't reach both. The realization hit him with the force of physical impact. Even at his maximum velocity, even with perfect trajectory calculation, even with Kryptonian reflexes that could perceive events in microsecond intervals, the mathematics were absolute. The torpedoes would impact within 3 seconds of each other, and the distance between them exceeded his ability to intercept sequentially. He had to choose. Downtown had higher population density. Schools, hospitals, office buildings packed with workers who had not yet evacuated. The harbor district had the docks, warehouses, industrial sectors, and residential neighborhoods housing families who worked the waterfront and could not afford the gleaming towers of the financial district. Superman had spent his entire adult life trying to save everyone, refusing to accept that sometimes saving everyone was mathematically impossible. Heroes did not make triage decisions. Heroes saved everyone, or they died trying. He chose the harbor district, not because fewer people would die, the numbers were close enough that the distinction was meaningless, but because the harbor district was where he had first learned to fly as a boy, where Jonathan Kent had taken him fishing and taught him that power without compassion was just another word for tyranny. Sentiment, not logic. Heart, not head. He hated himself for having to choose at all. Superman dove toward the harbor torpedo, his velocity building to Mach 30, the air around him igniting from friction, his body a meteor of its own creation. He reached the weapon 2 kilometers above the waterfront, grabbed it with both hands, and without slowing redirected its trajectory skyward, using his momentum to launch it toward the exosphere like a pitcher hurling a fastball to God. The torpedo tried to correct, thrusters firing desperately, but Superman had imparted too much velocity. It climbed, still accelerating from the impulse Superman had delivered, racing toward the thermosphere where detonation would harm nothing but radiation-hardened satellites and the fleet itself. Behind him, the downtown torpedo reached terminal velocity. Superman turned mid-flight and saw it falling, saw the city rising to meet it, saw the towers of glass and steel that held tens of thousands of people who trusted that, when the impossible happened, someone would stop it. He was not going to make it in time. The torpedo was at 3,000 meters when Wonder Woman's lasso caught it. She had launched herself from the watchtower's emergency deployment bay the moment the torpedoes had begun their descent, her trajectory calculated by the watchtower's tactical AI to intersect the weapon at the last possible second. Her lasso, woven from girdle threads of the goddess Hestia herself, unbreakable and infused with divine truth, wrapped around the torpedo's midsection 3 times in perfect coils. Diana, princess of Themyscira, daughter of Hippolyta, chosen champion of the Olympians, set her feet against the air itself and pulled. The lasso went taut. The torpedo's descent slowed fractionally, momentum fighting divine strength, physics arguing with mythology and finding the debate more balanced than logic suggested it should be. Diana's arms burned, not from physical strain but from the sheer audacity of trying to arrest a falling star through nothing but will and silk. She would not be enough alone. Green Lantern materialized beside her, his ring blazing with emerald light as he constructed a massive energy net beneath the torpedo, a lattice of hard light physics that spread across the sky like a geometric spider web. The torpedo hit the net and slowed further, kinetic energy dissipating across thousands of connection points, each one distributing force, according to equations. John Stewart had learned building bridges before he learned to build them from willpower. The flash appeared on a rooftop directly below, vibrating at frequencies calculated to generate an updraft, his molecules oscillating so fast they created localized pressure differentials that pushed against the torpedo's descent like an invisible cushion. It was thermodynamics performed at speed, impossible and perfect. Hawkgirl flew in from the west, her neth metal wings cutting through the air with the shriek of divine alloy meeting atmospheric resistance. Her mace swinging not to strike but to generate counterforce, pressure waves that pushed against the torpedo's forward momentum, and Superman, seeing his friends, his family, his team assembled without orders or discussion or hesitation, felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known had been tight. He reached the torpedo with 200 meters to spare, grabbed it alongside Wonder Woman's lasso, and together they redirected its trajectory one final time, sending it screaming toward the ocean, where its detonation would spend itself on water and distance rather than flesh and dreams. It hit the Atlantic 40 kilometers offshore, diving deep before physics and fury converged. The explosion created a column of water that climbed a kilometer into the sky, a geyser of superheated steam and shockwave that radiated outward in concentric rings. Tidal forces surged, waves racing toward the coast with enough energy to threaten flooding. The Flash was already there, running along the waterline at speeds that created a barrier of motion, his velocity pushing the waves back, negating their momentum through the absurd physics of a man who had long ago decided that speed limits were polite suggestions he was too busy to acknowledge. The water subsided. The waves collapsed. The harbor district remained standing, its residents staring out windows at an ocean that had briefly tried to devour them and failed. Above Metropolis, the Justice League hovered in loose formation, each member exhausted in ways that transcended mere physical fatigue. They had stopped an apocalypse through coordination and trust, through the implicit understanding that when one of them said jump, the others would already be in the air, asking how high from orbit. Superman met Wonder Woman's eyes and saw his own grim determination reflected back. They had stopped the immediate threat. But the fleet remained, floating in the sky like a promise of greater violence to come. And now, everyone aboard those ships would know that Earth had defenders capable of stopping their weapons, which meant the next attack would escalate. Aboard the unrelenting Righteousness, Lord Solar Kalor stared at the tactical display with an expression that suggested his worldview had just undergone violent reinterpretation. The hololithic feed showed multiple entities, each one demonstrating capabilities that ranged from merely impossible to theologically problematic. A female warrior wielding what appeared to be a glowing rope that could physically restrain a cyclonic torpedo. A male entity generating emerald constructs from nothing, hard light projections that suggested either Xenos technology or warp sorcery. Another moving at velocities that made his auger systems report critical sensor malfunction. And the original entity, the one in blue and red, who had dismantled 2 torpedoes bare-handed and was now hovering at altitude, staring directly at the bridge Oculus as though he could see through 12 meters of armored ceramite. Perhaps he could. Threat assessment, Kalor demanded, his voice retaining its characteristic flatness despite the fact that every assumption underlying this compliance action had just been rendered obsolete. The tech priest's mechadendrites twitched with the digital equivalent of panic. Unable to properly categorize, Lord Solar, multiple entities demonstrating capabilities exceeding established Xenos or warp-based threat parameters. The female entity's restraining implement appears to violate conservation of energy principles. The entity generating emerald constructs is doing so without detectable power source or warp resonance. The entity moving at superluminal velocity should be experiencing relativistic effects that would render it non-functional. And the primary entity, designation Blue, has now survived exposure to 2 cyclonic detonations with no measurable degradation of capability. Commander Grail stepped forward, his armor's vox grill distorting his voice into a mechanical growl. We are not facing a conventional defense force. This is coordinated, supernatural in nature, recommendation, immediate escalation to inquisitorial oversight. We may be dealing with warp entities masquerading as human defenders. No warp signatures, the tech priest interjected. Repeated scans show no immaterium contamination, no demonic resonance, no psychic backwash. Whatever these entities are, they are not creatures of chaos. Then what are they? Silence answered, broken only by the omnipresent hum of the ship's plasma reactors and the distant screaming of servitors undergoing routine maintenance that qualified as torture in any civilization that remembered mercy. Kaelor made a decision, the kind that separated Lord Solas from lesser commanders. The kind that meant accepting that doctrine had limits and improvisation, though heretical, was occasionally necessary. Open communications channel, wideband broadcast. I will speak with these entities directly. Lord Solar, the Codex Imperialis strictly forbids direct negotiation with unidentified hostiles prior to compliance. The Codex Imperialis was written by Primarchs who never faced entities capable of dismantling cyclonic torpedoes by hand. Kaelor interrupted. Open the channel. The communications officer, a woman whose face had been replaced by a Vox array during her ascension to servitor status, manipulated controls that humans were no longer trusted to operate. The channel opened, broadcast across all frequencies, a voice that would boom from every radio, every television, every emergency system within 50 kilometers. When Lord Solar Kaelor spoke, his voice carried the authority of 10,000 years of Imperium might, but for the first time in his 73 years of service, it also carried something that might have been mistaken for respect. Entities of the third planet, you have demonstrated capabilities that warrant recognition as threat grade Alpha or higher. Your interference with compliance actions has been noted and evaluated. I am Lord Solar Adrastus Kaelor, commanding the Iron Talon Crusade fleet under authorization of the High Lords of Terra and the God Emperor's eternal will. You will identify yourselves and state your allegiance. You will explain the nature of your capabilities and their origin. You will clarify whether you speak for this world's population or represent a separate power structure. Failure to comply with these requests will result in escalation of force beyond what you have thus far witnessed. The Imperium's patience is not infinite, but neither is it arbitrary. Respond. In the sky above Metropolis, Superman hovered alongside his teammates, listening to words that managed to be both a threat and an offer simultaneously. Behind him, Green Lantern was already running probability calculations based on the fleet's visible weapons arrays. Wonder Woman's hand rested on the hilt of her sword, ready but not drawn. The Flash vibrated at a frequency that kept him invisible to conventional sensors. A precaution. Hawkgirl's wings spread wide, nth metal humming with readiness. They were exhausted, not from the physical exertion, though that had been considerable, but from the emotional weight of realizing that the universe had just become exponentially more complicated. An entire civilization, an empire spanning who knew how many worlds, had arrived claiming authority they did not possess, and demonstrating a willingness to kill that transcended casual brutality into systematic doctrine. And they wanted to talk. Superman activated the communication device embedded in his belt, a Justice League issue system that could broadcast across frequencies from radio to quantum entanglement. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, measured, the tone of a man who had learned that how you said something was often as important as what you said. Lord Solar Kaelor, my name is Superman. I'm a member of the Justice League, a group dedicated to protecting Earth and its people from threats they cannot face alone. The individuals with me are Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, the Flash, and Hawkgirl. We are not a separate power structure. We're citizens of Earth who have chosen to use our abilities in service of others. We don't speak for all of humanity, but we will defend humanity when necessary. He paused, choosing his next words carefully, aware that billions of people were listening to this conversation, that history was being written in real time by what was said and how it was received. We're not part of your Imperium. Earth is an independent world. We have our own governments, our own cultures, our own right to self-determination. The demands you've made, conscription, technological audits, forced religious conversion, are violations of sovereignty that we cannot accept. But we also recognize that you may not have arrived here by choice, that the rift that brought you may have been beyond your control. Another pause. This one weighted with the burden of what came next. We don't want war with you. We've seen what your weapons can do, and we understand that escalation would cost lives on both sides. But we also won't stand by while you attempt to subjugate our world. So here's what I'm proposing. A face-to-face meeting, neutral ground, you, me, and whoever you want to bring to negotiate. We discuss this situation like rational beings and find a solution that doesn't require anyone else to die. You've called for compliance. I'm calling for conversation. Which do you think is more likely to achieve a lasting peace? The transmission ended. Superman waited, hovering in the thin air of the upper atmosphere, surrounded by teammates who trusted him to navigate diplomatic waters that none of them had training for. Below, Metropolis held its collective breath. In the watchtower, Batman monitored every sensor reading, building profiles and threat assessments, preparing contingencies for if this went wrong. Aboard the unrelenting Righteousness, Lord Solar Kalor listened to Superman's words and performed calculations that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with survival. He had witnessed these entities stop weapons that should have been unstoppable. He had seen them coordinate without apparent communication, respond without apparent command structure, act with precision that suggested either years of training or instinctual synchronization. Fighting them would cost more ships and lives than any compliance action in his career. And unlike most rebellions, which could be starved into submission or worn down through attrition, these entities showed no sign of fatigue, no indication that prolonged conflict would degrade their capability. And the entity calling itself Superman had just offered a diplomatic solution, phrasing it in terms that suggested both strength and restraint, both capability and reluctance to use it. It was not compliance, but it was communication, which was more than most Xenos or heretics offered. Kalor looked at Commander Grail, whose expression behind his helmet was surely one of outrage at the suggestion that they negotiate with enemies of the Imperium. Then he looked at the Inquisitorial Observer, whose mirrored mask reflected his own face back at him, forcing him to confront his own decision. Lord Solar, the Observer spoke, her voice modulated to remove identifying characteristics. You understand that any negotiation with unidentified entities capable of such power will require extensive inquisitorial oversight and may result in post-action review of your command decisions. Kalor nodded once. I am aware. But I did not achieve my rank by repeating mistakes that wiser commanders had already made. If there is a possibility of compliance through dialogue rather than total planetary sterilization, the Emperor's will demands we explore it. The Imperium's purpose is to unite humanity, not exterminate it. If these entities are human, if this world can be brought into the fold without reducing it to ash, that outcome serves the Emperor more faithfully than pride or doctrine. It was a speech that would be recorded, analyzed, and cited in inquisitorial proceedings for years to come. It was also the truth as Kalor understood it, shaped by 73 years of warfare that had taught him the difference between victory and survival. Open the channel, he commanded. The transmission reactivated. When Kalor spoke, his voice had not softened, but it had acquired a new dimension, a willingness to entertain possibilities that moments before had been categorized as heresy. Superman, your proposal is noted and provisionally accepted. We will agree to a face-to-face negotiation under the following conditions. The meeting will occur at coordinates of our choosing, on the surface, within visual range of our fleet, so that any treachery can be immediately responded to. You will attend with no more than 2 additional entities. I will attend with equivalent escort. You will submit to preliminary scanning for evidence of warp taint or Xenos contamination. If you are found to be free of chaos corruption, we will proceed with dialogue regarding the status of your world and the possibility of peaceful integration into the Imperium. Kalor paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. But understand this, Superman. The Imperium has stood for 10,000 years. We have conquered galaxies and purged millions of worlds of corruption. We do not compromise our principles out of weakness or fear. If negotiation fails, if your world refuses to acknowledge Imperial authority, we possess weapons that make cyclonic torpedoes look like firecrackers. I prefer to avoid their use, but I will not hesitate if you force my hand. The Emperor's will is absolute, and his mercy has limits. Superman absorbed the words, passing threat from negotiation, identifying the parameters being established. It was not a perfect offer. The implicit threat of greater destruction, the demand for submission to scanning, the assumption that the Imperium's authority was legitimate and Earth's sovereignty was negotiable, all of these were problems that would need to be addressed. But it was a chance, a narrow, fragile chance, to prevent the immediate escalation to total war. "We accept your conditions," Superman replied. "Transmit the coordinates. We'll be there." The coordinates came through seconds later, a location in the Midwest, farmland in Kansas, far from major population centers, a place where if things went catastrophically wrong, the collateral damage would be measured in acres rather than lives. It was also, Superman realized as he processed the location data, within 50 miles of Smallville. Of course it was. The universe had a sense of irony so sharp it occasionally drew blood. Justice League. Superman's voice carried across their shared communication channel. "Prepare for diplomatic contact with potentially hostile forces. Batman, I need you monitoring from the watchtower with every sensor we have. If this goes wrong, I need immediate tactical analysis and extraction protocols. Diana, you're with me. John, I want you in telepathic standby. If any of them are psychers or possess mental capabilities, I need you as early warning." Responses came back in clipped acknowledgements, each League member already moving to their assigned positions, preparation rituals honed through years of facing threats that required both violence and diplomacy in measures that shifted without warning. Superman looked at the fleet hanging in the sky, floating fortresses of conviction and firepower, and felt the weight of what came next settle across his shoulders like a cape woven from responsibility and impossible choices. In 2 hours, he would sit across from representatives of an empire that saw mercy as weakness and compassion as corruption. He would try to convince them that Earth deserved to remain free, that its people were not heretics in need of purging but human beings entitled to determine their own future. He would try to do this without fighting, because fighting meant casualties, and casualties meant failure by every metric that mattered. He would try, and trying would have to be enough, because the alternative was unthinkable. The sky was still torn, the wound between dimensions bleeding impossible colors across the atmosphere. The fleet maintained its position, weapons powered but not firing, a promise held in abeyance, and somewhere in the distance, clocks ticked toward a meeting that would determine whether Earth's tomorrow would be written in cooperation or conquest, dialogue or destruction. Superman flew toward Kansas, toward home, toward a confrontation that would test not his strength but his hope, and he carried with him the prayers of a world that had just learned they were not alone in the universe. They had learned it the hard way, as most truths worth knowing were learned. The sky would take time to heal, if it healed at all, but healing would have to wait. First came the talking, and after that, if talking failed, would come the war. The farmland stretched in gentle undulations of amber grain and soil, the color of rust, unmarred by development or the aggressive geometry of industrial agriculture. This was heartland America preserved in amber, protected by a farming community that valued tradition over profit margins and measured prosperity in soil quality rather than quarterly returns. The sky above was the deep blue of late afternoon, clouds painted in gradations of white and gray that suggested rain might arrive before evening, moisture pulled from the Gulf by pressure systems that cared nothing for the drama unfolding beneath them. Superman descended slowly, his boots touching the earth with the gentleness of a man returning home after too long away. The field belonged to the Kent farm, or had once, before he had established a trust to maintain it as undeveloped land in perpetuity, a monument to a childhood spent learning that power without humility was just tyranny with better branding. He could see the old farmhouse in the distance, the red barn with its paint peeling in abstract patterns, the fence line where he had first learned to fly by accident after a wasp sting had triggered an adrenaline response his alien biology had interpreted as permission to ignore gravity. Diana landed beside him, her armor gleaming in the afternoon light, a warrior goddess manifested in steel and determination. She had changed from her combat configuration to her diplomatic armor, less aggressive in its silhouette but no less protective, every surface etched with Greek inscriptions that translated roughly to peace through superior firepower. But we'd really prefer just the peace part. They were not alone in the field. The Imperial delegation had arrived first, transported down via shuttlecraft that had burned furrows in the soil with retrothruster backwash. Lord Solar Kalor stood at the center of a loose formation, his Terminator armor making him look like a walking monument to warfare rendered mobile. To his left stood Commander Grail, his crimson plate adorned with purity seals that whispered prayers in the wind. To his right, the Inquisitorial Observer, her mirrored mask reflecting the sky in ways that made determining where her attention focused impossible. Behind them, at precisely measured intervals, stood 20 crimson Castellans Astartes in full battle plate, bolters held at ceremonial rest, but hands positioned for immediate deployment if negotiations deteriorated into violence. They were an honor guard and a firing squad simultaneously, symbolism and threat married in ceramite and faith. Between the two groups, a no-man's land of approximately 50 meters, empty, save for the grain swaying in the breeze and the grasshoppers that leaped away from the sudden presence of beings whose weight and heat disrupted their simple insect imperatives. Superman stepped forward, Diana matching his pace, their movements synchronized without discussion or signal. They stopped at the midpoint of the empty space and waited. Kalor mirrored the movement, walking forward with Grail and the Observer flanking him, their steps measured, precise, a military cadence that had been drilled into muscle memory through years of parade grounds and battlefield approaches. They stopped exactly 3 meters from Superman and Diana, close enough for conversation, far enough that a sudden lunge would be telegraphed by body language and trajectory. For a long moment, no one spoke. The two groups studied each other with the intensity of predators trying to determine if the creature across from them was prey, threat, or something that required an entirely new category. Lord Solar Kalor broke the silence, his voice emerging from his armor's vox grill with a mechanical rasp that stripped away any warmth the words might have carried. "You came. That suggests either genuine interest in diplomatic resolution or confidence that you can survive if negotiations fail." "Both," Superman replied, his tone even, friendly without being soft. "We want peace, but we're prepared for the alternative if you force it. Pragmatic. I can respect that, even if I question the hubris underlying it." Kalor's eyes, visible through his helmet's lenses, tracked across Superman's face, studying, cataloging. "You do not look like Xenos. Scans indicate human physiology, or something so close that the distinction becomes academic. Yet you demonstrate capabilities that exceed any human I have encountered in 73 years of service to the Imperium. Explain." Superman had prepared for this question, had rehearsed responses that ranged from truthful to strategically vague. He chose truth, modified by necessity. "I'm not originally from Earth. I was born on another world, a planet called Krypton that no longer exists. My biological parents sent me here as an infant, and I was raised by human parents in Kansas, about 40 miles from where we're standing. Kryptonian physiology interacts with Earth's yellow sun in ways that grant me certain abilities. I'm not human by biology, but I'm human by choice, by upbringing, by loyalty. Earth is my home. These are my people. I will defend them." The Inquisitorial Observer leaned forward fractionally, her voice emerging from vocalizers that stripped all identifying characteristics, leaving only words. "You claim Xeno's origin yet integration into human society. This is precisely the kind of infiltration that has destroyed civilizations. How do we know you are not an advanced scout for your species, preparing this world for invasion?" "Because Krypton is dead," Superman said, and there was enough quiet pain in his voice that even the Observer paused. "Destroyed by internal collapse when I was an infant. I'm the last of my kind, as far as I know. There's no invasion coming because there's no one left to invade. I'm just a man trying to do the right thing with the abilities I was born with." Kalor processed this information with the expression of a man who had heard variations on this story 1,000 times and learned to identify which versions were truth and which were heresy wearing truth's clothing. a Xenos orphan raised by humans, claiming human identity despite inhuman capability. In the Imperium, this would be classified as abhuman at best, Xenos contamination at worst. The normal response would be either execution or conscription into a penal legion. You would be used as a weapon until you died, at which point your genetic material would be harvested for study and your remains burned to prevent Xenos cult formation around your corpse. That's barbaric, Diana interjected, her voice carrying the hard edge of someone who had witnessed barbarism across centuries and never developed tolerance for it. That is necessary, Grail corrected. The galaxy is not kind, Princess. It does not reward mercy or tolerance. Humanity survived 10,000 years of darkness, betrayal, and assault from every Xenos species imaginable by maintaining strict protocols regarding genetic purity and xenological threat assessment. Compassion for individuals is a luxury that civilizations facing extinction cannot afford. You're not facing extinction here, Superman said, his voice hardening. You arrived in our space, made demands, launched weapons against civilians. From our perspective, you're the existential threat, not us. From your perspective, Kaylor acknowledged, that may be true, but perspectives are shaped by experience, and your world has not experienced the horrors that forged the Imperium. You have not faced tyrannid hive fleets that consume entire worlds and leave nothing but sterile rock. You have not witnessed chaos corruption that turns human populations into screaming psychic batteries for demonic entities. You have not watched as orc wargs multiply exponentially, turning peaceful systems into war zones where violence becomes self-sustaining. You exist in isolation, ignorant of the threats that surround you, and that ignorance has made you soft. He gestured toward the fleet hanging in the sky, still visible as dark shapes against the afternoon blue. The Imperium is not soft. We are hard because the universe made us hard. We enforce compliance, not out of cruelty, but out of the learned understanding that divided humanity is weak humanity, and weakness is death. We offer you protection, order, structure. Yes, there is a cost. Yes, your world would change. But the alternative is that eventually, something worse than us will find you, and when it does, your mercy and tolerance will not save you. They will merely ensure you die with clear consciences. It was a speech delivered with utter sincerity, every word believed with the fervor of faith, backed by decades of evidence. Lord Solar Kalor was not lying or exaggerating. He genuinely saw the Imperium as humanity's only hope, its violence as regrettable necessity, its cruelty as the price of survival. And that made him more dangerous than any malicious tyrant could ever be, because you could not reason with someone who believed that atrocity was virtue. Superman met Kalor's eyes and saw the gulf between them, a chasm carved by worldview and experience that no amount of words would bridge. But he tried anyway, because trying was all he had. Lord Solar, I understand you believe you're protecting humanity. I understand that your Imperium has faced threats that justify the measures you've described. But Earth has faced threats too. We've fought alien invasions, interdimensional incursions, cosmic entities that treat galaxies as chess pieces. We've done it without becoming the monsters we fought. We've maintained our values, our compassion, our belief that every life has worth, and we've survived. Not through brutality, but through cooperation, through heroes who choose to defend rather than conquer. He gestured to Diana, then to the sky where the rest of the Justice League monitored from orbit. We're not weak. We're not naive, we're different. We've built a civilization based on hope rather than fear, on cooperation rather than domination. And we're asking you to respect that difference, to acknowledge that there might be more than one way for humanity to survive, to thrive. Kalor was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable behind his helmet's impassive mask. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested this was not the first time he had heard this argument, and it had never ended well. Hope, he said, and the word sounded like a curse in his mechanical rasp. You speak of hope as though it were a strategy, a defense against the horrors of the galaxy. I have seen hope, Superman. I have watched it die on 100 worlds. I have held the bodies of soldiers who believed their hope would protect them, found their corpses dismembered by Xenos who cared nothing for human optimism. Hope is not a weapon, it is not armor, it is a failure of imagination. An unwillingness to accept that the universe is cruel, and survival requires matching that cruelty. Then we disagree, Superman said quietly. And I'm sorry for that, because it means we can't find common ground. No, Kalor agreed. We cannot. The inquisitorial observer stepped forward, her mirrored mask tilting as though examining both Superman and the surrounding environment for threats that might justify immediate violence. There remains the matter of planetary compliance. Even if we accept that you personally are not a threat, that you are a Xenos anomaly motivated by altruism, the rest of your world still requires integration into the Imperium. Your governments must submit, your technology must be audited, your populations must be tithed. This is not negotiable. Everything's negotiable, Superman countered. We're negotiating right now. You are delaying, the observer corrected. Attempting to buy time through dialogue while you formulate defensive strategies. Standard tactical behavior for inferior forces facing superior ones. The Imperium is not fooled by such tactics, Superman. We have conquered civilizations that employed them for centuries before accepting inevitable defeat. Wonder Woman's hand moved fractionally toward her sword, a warrior's instinct responding to threat implications. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone whose diplomatic credentials were older than most nations. You keep referring to the Imperium as though its authority were universal and unchallengeable, but you're in our solar system now. By what right do you claim jurisdiction over a world you've never seen before today? By the right of the God Emperor's mandate, Grail said, his voice resonant with absolute conviction. The Emperor of mankind, he who unified Terra and launched the Great Crusade, decreed that all human worlds belong under imperial sovereignty. Distance does not negate that decree. Time does not erode that authority. Your isolation was accident or abandonment, not abdication of imperial claim. We are not invaders, we are reclamation forces, reuniting lost children with their rightful civilization. We're not children. Diana's voice dropped to a temperature that suggested volcanic activity was imminent. We're sovereign beings on a sovereign world. Your emperor, God or otherwise, has no authority here, and if you attempt to enforce your claim through violence, you'll discover that we take our independence very seriously. The tension in the field had been building gradually, a slow accumulation of incompatible worldviews pressing against each other like tectonic plates finding the limits of their patience. Now it reached critical threshold, the air itself seeming to compress, to wait, to hold its breath in anticipation of violence. Superman raised his hand in a calming gesture, directed at both sides simultaneously. Let's step back. We're here to talk, not to escalate. Diana, Lord Solar, everyone, we need to find a middle ground. There is no middle ground between compliance and heresy, Kalor said flatly. There is only submission or death. Those are the choices the galaxy offers, regardless of how much you wish otherwise. Then we'll take death before submission, Superman replied, and his voice carried none of its usual warmth, only the hard certainty of someone who had just drawn a line that would not be uncrossed. But before anyone commits to that path, I want you to understand what you're choosing. Earth has defended itself against threats you can't imagine. Entities that reshape reality with thought, gods who treat timelines like personal playgrounds. We've survived because we're strong, because we're united, and because we refuse to compromise our values, even when it would be easier to surrender them. He took a step forward, closing the distance to Kalor by half, his presence suddenly filling the space between them with an intensity that made even the Astartes honor guard shift their grips on their bolters. You call it hope. I call it strength. The strength to say no when the universe demands yes. The strength to protect without dominating, to defend without destroying. You came here expecting to find a weak world ripe for conquest. Instead, you found people willing to fight for their freedom. That should tell you something about the cost of the war you're considering. Kaylor stared at Superman for a long moment, his augmetic systems running threat assessments and probability calculations, estimating the force required to subdue an entity that had survived cyclonic detonations and dismantled Astartes strike teams. The numbers came back with assessments that ranged from improbable to impossible, clustered around a mean that suggested victory was achievable only through attrition and acceptable casualties numbered in the millions. He had commanded campaigns where acceptable casualties were measured in billions, but those had been against Xenos and heretics, against enemies whose destruction served the Emperor's will with mathematical certainty. This was different. These were humans, aberrant perhaps, isolated certainly, but recognizably human in motivation and morality. Destroying them would be compliance, but it would also be waste, the loss of genetic material and potential recruits that the Imperium could not easily replace. And if he was honest with himself, which he rarely allowed himself to be, there was something in Superman's words that resonated with a part of him he had thought dead, a fragment of the young officer who had first donned Imperial uniform and believed he was saving humanity rather than just executing it more efficiently. "A recess," Kaylor said abruptly. "We will suspend negotiations for 6 hours. Both parties will withdraw to their respective positions and consider terms that might bridge our differences. Reconvene at sunset. If no agreement can be reached, we will accept that conflict is inevitable and conduct ourselves accordingly." It was not a concession, but it was also not an immediate declaration of war, which in the context of this conversation qualified as diplomatic progress. Superman nodded slowly. 6 hours. We'll use the time wisely." Both groups withdrew, walking backward initially to maintain visual contact, a warrior's habit of never turning one's back on a potential enemy until distance provided safety. The Astartes honor guard formed up around Kaylor, their massive forms creating a mobile fortress of ceramite and absolute loyalty. Superman and Diana lifted into the air, ascending toward the Justice League contingent monitoring from high altitude. Behind them, the field returned to its natural state, the grain swaying in the breeze, the grasshoppers resuming their simple routines, nature indifferent to the diplomacy of apex predators who had temporarily chosen words over violence. But the tension remained, a weight in the atmosphere that could be felt by anyone with sufficient sensitivity to emotional currents. The war had been postponed, not prevented, and both sides knew that the 6-hour recess would be spent not in contemplation but in preparation, in formulating strategies for a conflict both sides claimed not to want but were rapidly making inevitable. The sky waited, its wound still bleeding impossible colors, a constant reminder that the laws of physics were negotiable under sufficient stress. What came next would test whether the laws of morality were equally flexible, and whether hope or doctrine would triumph when forced to compete at gunpoint. The watchtower floated in geosynchronous orbit above Earth, a crystalline fortress of alien alloy and human engineering that served as the Justice League's sanctuary, command center, and reminder that Earth's protectors were never truly off duty. Its observation deck offered panoramic views of the planet below, a sphere of blue and green and white that carried the sum total of human civilization on a crust of rock cycling through space at 17,000 miles per hour, blissfully ignorant of its own fragility. Superman stood at the viewport, still in costume, but with his cape bearing scorch marks from the cyclonic torpedo's detonation. Around him, the Justice League had assembled in various states of preparation and concern, each member processing the implications of an empire that measured its territory in systems rather than continents. Batman stood closest, his cowl pulled back to reveal Bruce Wayne's face, carved from the same stone as Gothic cathedrals but significantly less optimistic. He was reviewing holographic tactical displays projected from the watchtower's central computer, analyzing the Imperial fleet's formations, weapon loadouts, probable crew complements, and a dozen other variables that would matter if diplomacy failed. "They're not posturing," Batman said, his voice carrying the flat effect he employed when delivering particularly unpleasant analysis. "Every ship in that fleet is battle-ready, fully loaded with ammunition and troops. They came here expecting resistance and prepared to overcome it through overwhelming force. The cyclonic torpedoes were a test, not an opening salvo. They were measuring our response time and capability. They got their measurement, the Flash observed, from where he vibrated slightly in his chair, metabolic energy requiring constant motion. We stopped their weapons. Shouldn't that discourage further escalation? It confirms we're a threat worth taking seriously. Wonder Woman corrected, her armor bearing scratches from the torpedo retrieval that would require Amazonian smithing to properly repair. In their doctrine, threat equals heresy. We just validated every paranoid assumption they brought with them. Green Lantern John Stewart rotated a three-dimensional hologram of the fleet's flagship, his ring highlighting structural weaknesses and probable shield generator locations with emerald markers. I've built defensive structures on 36 worlds. These ships are designed for siege warfare, planetary occupation, sustained campaigns. They're not here for a quick raid. They're here to stay until they get what they came for, which is total compliance, Superman said quietly, his eyes never leaving the view of Earth below. They want to turn our world into a component of their empire, conscript our young, audit our technology, replace our governments with their administrators, transform everything we are into another version of what they are. John Johns stood apart from the others, his form shifting subtly as emotional currents in the room affected his Martian physiology. His voice, when he spoke, carried harmonics that suggested multiple thought streams processing simultaneously. I attempted a surface-level telepathic scan during your meeting. Their minds are unlike anything I have encountered. The Astartes warriors are conditioned to a degree that borders on lobotomy, vast portions of their consciousness dedicated solely to warfare and devotion, with emotional range narrowed to anger, duty, and faith. The Lord Solar's mind is more complete, but encased in certainty so absolute it creates a kind of psychic armor. He genuinely believes that what he does serves humanity's best interests. That makes him more dangerous than a malicious enemy, Hawkgirl observed from where she inspected her Neth metal mace, checking for microfractures from the impacts she had delivered against the torpedo. You can negotiate with someone who knows they're being cruel. But a true believer who thinks his cruelty is kindness, that's someone who'll burn worlds and sleep soundly afterward. Which brings us to the central question, Batman said, turning away from his tactical displays to face Superman directly. Can we coexist with them? Is there a negotiated settlement that satisfies their need for human unification and our need for independence? Or is this a zero-sum situation where only total victory or total defeat are possible? Superman was silent for a long moment, his super hearing unconsciously tracking conversations across the planet below. In Metropolis, families were evacuating, loading cars with essentials and fleeing toward relatives in cities they perceived as safer, though nowhere on Earth was truly safe if the fleet decided to commence orbital bombardment. In Washington, the president was addressing a joint session of Congress, attempting to project calm while the military prepared for a war that all their training had insisted was impossible. In the streets of 100 cities, people looked at the sky and wondered if they would see tomorrow's sunrise or if the universe had finally decided that humanity's time was up. I don't know, Superman admitted, and the honesty in his voice was more frightening than any bravado could have been. Everything in me wants to believe that we can find common ground, that reason and compassion can bridge the gap between our worldviews. But I listened to Kalor speak, and I saw someone who's so convinced of his righteousness that he interprets mercy as weakness and compromise as betrayal. He's not evil, that's the problem. He's not a villain I can fight. He's a good man who's been convinced that terrible things are necessary, and that makes him almost impossible to reach. Then we prepare for war, Diana said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had fought in wars that became myths, who had seen civilizations rise and fall and learned that some conflicts could only be resolved through force. If they won't be reasoned with, we stop them. We defend Earth the way we've always defended it, with everything we have until there's nothing left to give. That fleet has at least 40 capital ships, hundreds of support vessels, and probably tens of thousands of troops, Batman interjected. We're 7 people, 8 if we count Aquaman, and he can convince the oceans to cooperate, which given his current diplomatic standing in Atlantis is questionable. The mathematics of this engagement are not favorable. Mathematics have been against us before, the Flash countered. We faced alien invasions, demon armies, time-traveling warlords. We always find a way. This is different. Batman's voice was sharp enough to cut the optimism from the air. Previous threats were single entities or small forces that relied on gimmicks, cosmic powers, or terror. This is military doctrine refined over 10,000 years. They know how to fight wars. They know how to occupy planets. They know how to break resistance through attrition. We might win individual battles, but wars are won through logistics, and they have 10,000 years of logistics experience. The room fell into silence, each member of the League processing the implications of Batman's analysis. They were protectors, not conquerors. Defenders, not occupiers. Their strength lay in rapid response, surgical intervention, the ability to stop crises before they cascaded into catastrophes. But the Imperium was offering them a catastrophe already in progress, asking them to stop something that had momentum measured in millennia and force measured in fleets. Superman turned from the viewport, his expression set with determination that had carried him through impossible situations before and would have to carry him through this one. Then we make them fight a kind of war they're not prepared for. They expect resistance to look like armies clashing, like planetary defense forces making last stands, like populations rising in futile rebellion before being crushed. We give them something else. Asymmetric warfare, Batman said, already following the logic, his tactical mind racing ahead to implications and applications. We don't meet them fleet to fleet. We attack their ability to project force, disrupt their supply lines, make occupation too costly to maintain. We demonstrate that conquering Earth isn't a compliance action, it's a quagmire, Green Lantern added, his ring already generating tactical scenarios. Make every inch of ground they take require more resources to hold than it's worth. But we do it without destroying Earth in the process, Superman emphasized. No scorched Earth tactics, no sacrificing cities to deny them resources. We fight smart, surgical, minimize casualties on both sides. You're still hoping to save them? Diana's question carried curiosity rather than judgment. Even after they've demonstrated that they'll kill millions to enforce their will? I'm hoping to save everyone, Superman corrected. Them, us, the civilians on both sides who didn't choose this conflict. Yes, they're following orders they believe are righteous. But most of them are just soldiers doing what they've been trained to do. If we can break their command structure, demonstrate that Earth isn't worth the cost they're paying, maybe we can force a withdrawal without total war. That's a lot of maybes, Hawkgirl observed. It's all we have, Superman replied. John stepped forward, his red eyes glowing with intensity that suggested multiple layers of telepathic activity occurring beneath his calm exterior. I may have an option that could provide intelligence we currently lack. The inquisitorial observer who attended the meeting, her mind was partially shielded but not impenetrable. I detected fragmentary thoughts, references to protocols and contingencies. If I could establish deeper contact, we might learn what their actual objectives are, what they consider acceptable outcomes, what their constraints and limitations are. Risky, Batman said. If they detect telepathic intrusion, it validates their concerns about psychic threats and gives them justification for immediate escalation. Everything we do from this point forward is risky, John countered. The question is whether the intelligence gain justifies the exposure. Before anyone could respond, alarms blazed across the Watchtower's systems, urgent warnings that indicated major energy signatures activating in the vicinity of the Imperial fleet. Holographic displays shifted, showing new contacts emerging from the larger vessels, dozens of smaller craft descending toward Earth's atmosphere in precise formations. They're deploying, Batman stated, his hands already moving through control sequences that brought the Watchtower's defensive systems to full alert. Drop pods, landing craft, orbital insertion transports. They're not waiting for the recess to end. Superman was already moving toward the exit, his body a blue and red blur of determination and barely controlled fury. His voice echoed through the watchtower's communication system as he launched himself toward the nearest transit tube. "They want to test our resolve. They're about to learn that Earth doesn't break easily." The League mobilized with the efficiency of a team that had practiced this scenario in 100 different variations, each member moving to their assigned response vectors. Wonder Woman followed Superman through the transit tube, her lasso blazing with golden light. Green Lantern's ring flared as he generated a construct transport for himself and Hawkgirl. The Flash became a crimson streak, racing down toward the planet's surface at velocities that would have frightened physics if physics were capable of fear. Batman remained in the watchtower, his hands dancing across holographic controls, coordinating with military forces across the globe, establishing communication networks, preparing contingencies for scenarios that ranged from isolated skirmishes to total planetary war. This was what he did best. The strategic orchestration that turned heroes into force multipliers, that transformed individual strength into coordinated defense. On Earth below, the Imperial drop pods burned through the atmosphere like fallen stars, retro thrusters firing in sequences calculated to bring them down in designated zones across 7 continents. They were not targeting cities, not yet. They were establishing forward operating bases, creating supply nodes, implementing Phase 1 of standard planetary compliance doctrine. Inside the pods, Astartes checked their weapons, recited their litanies, and prepared to face whatever resistance this world could muster. They were confident in their training, their equipment, their faith. They had done this on 100 worlds before. They expected this compliance action to follow familiar patterns. They were about to discover that Earth was exceptional in ways that military doctrine had not prepared them for, that mythology sometimes manifested in flesh and determination, that hope, when properly motivated, could hit significantly harder than doctrine suggested it should. The war had not been declared, but it had begun regardless, initiated not by intent but by the slow-motion collision of incompatible worldviews operating at terminal velocity. And in the space between Earth and the fleet, in the thin atmosphere where sound could not travel and cold was absolute, the sky continued to bleed impossible colors, a wound that refused to heal, a reminder that some doors, once opened, could not be easily closed. The drop pods impacted across a military installation in Montana, 3 square miles of hardened bunkers and weapons depots that intelligence satellites had identified as a significant concentration of Earth's defensive capability. The Imperium's tactical doctrine was methodical, refined through 10,000 years of planetary compliance actions. Capture the military infrastructure first, establish forward operating bases, demonstrate overwhelming force, allow the civilian population to witness their defenders' defeat, negotiate surrender from a position of absolute dominance. It was a strategy that had never failed, applied across countless worlds, with variations accounting for local Xenos threats or chaotic contamination, but fundamentally unchanged since the Emperor himself had walked terror in the flesh. It was about to meet its first genuine challenge in millennia. The first Astartes to emerge from their pods were brothers Carlin and Tool of the Crimson Castellans, 3rd Company, veterans of 17 compliance actions between them, their armor-bearing campaign markings that told stories of victories against orcs, tyrannids, and chaos cultists. They stepped onto Montana soil with bolters ready, scanning for targets through auto-sense arrays that could detect heartbeats through concrete and identify heat signatures through thermal masking. They found empty bunkers, abandoned weapons racks, and a single man standing in the center of the compound's parade ground, arms crossed, cape rippling in winds generated by the drop pod's descent. Superman had been waiting for them, had watched them burn through the atmosphere with eyes that could track individual heat tiles on space shuttle re-entry, had calculated their landing vectors and chosen to intercept here because this base had been evacuated 2 hours prior on his recommendation. No one would die here today unless he failed to stop it. "You're trespassing on sovereign territory," Superman called out, his voice carrying across the compound without need for amplification. "Leave now, and this doesn't have to escalate." Brother Carlin responded by opening fire, his bolter chattering in controlled bursts that stitched a pattern toward Superman's chest. Each round was a self-propelled missile designed to penetrate armor and detonate internally, turning flesh to pulp and bone to shrapnel. Against any conventional opponent, even one wearing powered armor, it would have been immediately lethal. Against Superman, it was target practice. The bolts impacted his chest, his shoulders, his face, each one ricocheting away at wild angles, several detonating mid-air after their guidance systems lost lock on a target that refused to register as damaged. Superman stood utterly still, allowing them to empty their magazines, proving a point about the futility of conventional weapons. When the firing stopped, when the Astartes stood with weapons empty, and the air thick with cordite smell and ozone from detonations, Superman spoke again. "I gave you a chance to leave peacefully. You chose violence. What happens next is on you." He moved. To the Astartes, with their enhanced perception and combat reflex conditioning that operated in millisecond intervals, Superman should have been trackable. Every opponent was trackable, their movements governed by momentum and leverage and the physical constraints of muscle and mechanical systems. Superman ignored those constraints. He crossed the 100 meters between them in a time interval too short for their autosenses to properly measure, appeared directly in front of Brother Carlin, and with a single controlled push, sent the Astartes flying backward across the compound to impact a concrete bunker with force sufficient to crater the wall, but, crucially, not sufficient to breach his armor or cause internal injuries. Brother Thule pivoted, his training overriding the shock of seeing his battle brother treated like a projectile, and swung his chainsword in an arc calculated to bisect Superman at the waist. The weapon was a relic, blessed by the chapter's chaplain and anointed with oils rendered from the bones of a saint whose name had been lost to archival decay. Its chain teeth spun at velocities measured in thousands of rotations per minute, capable of chewing through ceramite and flesh with equal efficiency. The chainsword shattered against Superman's side, teeth exploding in a spray of adamantium fragments, the weapon's motor burning out in a squeal of destroyed gears and overloaded power cells. Superman caught Thule's wrist before the Astartes could react, lifted him with the same ease a human might lift a child, and carried him over to where Carlin was extracting himself from the crater. He set Thule down gently, deliberately, making a point. "I could kill you," Superman said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute certainty. "I could tear your armor apart and end you in seconds, but I'm not going to, because you're soldiers following orders you believe are righteous. You're victims of your own doctrine, and I won't punish you for that. But I also won't let you establish a foothold here. Go back to your ships. Tell your commanders that Earth is defended, and every attempt to occupy us will be met with the same response." Brother Carlin rose from the rubble, his armor's servo motors whining with the strain of supporting ceramite that had been partially compromised by impact trauma. He stared at Superman with eyes that had witnessed horrors that would have driven baseline humans insane, that had seen daemons manifest from human screams and tyrannid bioforms consume entire hive cities. None of it had prepared him for this, an entity that looked human, spoke like a moral philosopher, and treated Astartes like they were children being gently corrected. "You are an abomination," Carlin said, his vox grill lending his voice a mechanical rasp that stripped away any nuance. "A Xenos thing wearing human shape, corrupting this world with your presence. The Imperium will not be denied by one aberrant entity, regardless of its power. We will return with greater force, and when we do, your mercy will have accomplished nothing." "Maybe," Superman acknowledged, "but at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll sleep tonight knowing I chose restraint over carnage, that I didn't become the monster you expect me to be." Across the compound, more Astartes were emerging from their drop pods, squads assembling with practiced efficiency, weapons coming online, tactical Vox channels filling with situation reports and target acquisition data. They saw their brothers standing intact before an entity that doctrine demanded they engage and destroy, saw the shattered chainsword and the cratered wall, and made the calculations that experience and training provided. Threat level, catastrophic. Current force, insufficient. Require escalation. Squad Sergeant Mordran, commanding the deployment, activated his Vox link to the fleet. ground command to unrelenting righteousness. Entity designation: Blue engaged and neutralized assault team without lethal force. Request immediate reinforcement, Terminator squads and Dreadnought support. Current force inadequate for target suppression. The response came in Lord Solar Kalor's mechanical rasp. Reinforcements authorized. Maintain engagement. Prevent entity from interfering with additional deployment zones. Acceptable casualties for this action are 30% of engaged forces. 30%. Acceptable. The words hung in the Montana air like an epitaph for soldiers who had not yet died but whose deaths had already been budgeted into operational parameters. Superman heard the transmission, his superhuman hearing passing words from radio frequencies that humans would have needed sophisticated equipment to detect. He felt something cold settle in his chest, the realization that he was facing an opponent who measured lives in percentages and found those percentages acceptable. How do you reason with mathematics? How do you negotiate with doctrine that treats casualties as resources to be expended? Around the compound, more drop pods were burning through the sky, these larger, heavier, containing war machines that had been in service when humanity had first ventured to the stars. Dreadnoughts, walking sarcophagi containing the remains of Astartes too wounded to survive but too valuable to let die, their broken bodies entombed in adamantium shells and equipped with weapons that could level buildings. They crashed to Earth with impacts that registered on seismographs 300 miles away, massive war engines standing 15 feet tall, covered in armor that laughed at anti-tank weapons and bristling with assault cannons that could fire depleted uranium rounds at rates measured in thousands of rounds per minute. Brother Dreadnought Castian powered up with mechanical howls that spoke of rage internalized and weaponized, of a warrior who had died centuries ago but had been denied the peace of death because the Imperium's need for his violence exceeded his right to rest. His sensors locked onto Superman with targeting systems that integrated theological certainty and physics, autocannon barrels beginning to rotate, as ammunition feeds chambered rounds, blessed by Mechanicus priests, and inscribed with prayers of destruction. Superman looked at the Dreadnought and saw not a weapon but a tragedy. A man who should have been allowed to rest but had been conscripted into eternal war, his humanity stripped away until only rage and duty remained. He was tired of fighting, tired of defending, tired of trying to convince people who were too damaged by their own civilization to recognize mercy when it was offered, but he was not tired enough to give up. Not yet. Not while people needed defending. Superman rose into the air, levitating until he was eye level with the Dreadnought's sarcophagus, and spoke directly to the entombed warrior within. "I'm sorry for what they've done to you. I'm sorry you weren't allowed to die with dignity, that they turned you into a weapon and called it honor. But I can't let you hurt people. I can't let any of you establish a presence here. So I'm asking you one last time, stand down, return to your ships, and tell your commanders that Earth is not worth the lives they're about to spend." Castian's response was to fire his autocannon point blank, thousands of rounds per minute erupting in a stream of depleted uranium and fury, each impact against Superman's body, creating spark showers and ricochets that carved furrows in the ground and shattered windows in buildings 300 meters away. Superman endured it for exactly 3 seconds, allowing the Dreadnought to empty 30% of his ammunition load, then reached out and grabbed the autocannon barrels with both hands. He crushed them. His fingers, backed by Kryptonian physiology and willpower that had moved planets, compressed the barrels into useless scrap metal, rendering the weapons inoperable through the simple expedient of making their physics impossible. Then he placed one hand on the Dreadnought's sarcophagus, just above where the entombed warrior's head would be, and pushed. Not hard enough to damage, not enough to kill, but with sufficient force to make the multi-ton war engine take 3 steps backward. Servos screaming protest, gyroscopes struggling to maintain balance. "I don't want to hurt you," Superman said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "But I will stop you. Please don't make me." All across the compound, all across the 7 continents where Imperial forces were attempting to establish forward positions, similar scenes were unfolding. Wonder Woman was facing down an entire company of Imperial Guard infantry in Berlin, her lasso glowing with truth that made their weapons fall from hands that suddenly questioned whether their cause was just. Green Lantern and Hawk Girl were dismantling artillery positions in Brazil, ring constructs, and nth metal, making mockery of fortifications designed to withstand conventional assault. The Flash was evacuating civilians from conflict zones so quickly that from the Imperium's perspective, entire city blocks were simply emptying, as though their populations had been raptured by some Xenos god who favored speed. And in orbit, aboard the unrelenting Righteousness, Lord Solar Kalor watched tactical displays that showed his forces being systematically neutralized without corresponding casualty reports, his soldiers disarmed and humiliated but not killed, his war machines disabled but not destroyed. It was a military defeat wrapped in mercy, a demonstration that Earth's defenders could crush the Imperium's compliance action but were choosing not to, were deliberately pulling their punches in a display of restraint that was somehow more disturbing than total resistance would have been. Commander Gryle stood beside Kalor, his armor's Vox grill emitting a sound that might have been grinding teeth if his helmet had not been sealed. They mock us. They dismantle our forces with contempt for our strength, then offer us opportunities to retreat as though we were children being gently corrected. It is intolerable. It is effective, Kalor corrected. They have identified that our doctrine expects resistance to manifest as desperate violence, as populations and defenders fighting to their last breath because they have no other option. Instead, they demonstrate overwhelming capability combined with deliberate non-lethality. They are trying to convince us that occupation is impossible, not through destroying our forces but through demonstrating that suppressing them would require lethality we have thus far been unwilling to deploy against recognizably human populations. He turned from the tactical display to face the inquisitorial observer, whose mirrored mask reflected the bridge's harsh lighting in ways that made reading her reaction impossible. Your assessment, observer. Are we facing human defenders or Xenos infiltrators employing psychological warfare? The observer was silent for a long moment, her head tilted as though listening to voices Kalor could not hear, consulting with authorities whose jurisdiction transcended military command. When she spoke, her modulated voice carried weight that suggested entire inquisitorial deliberations had occurred in those seconds of silence. The entity Superman's genetic structure, insofar as we can determine from long-range scanning, is Xenos in origin but human in cognitive function. He was raised by humans, identifies as human, operates according to human moral frameworks despite capabilities that exceed human limitations. The distinction between nature and nurture becomes academic when both produce behaviors that align with human preservation rather than Xenos infiltration or chaos corruption. She paused, then continued with something that might have been reluctance. His restraint suggests either sophisticated long-term strategy or genuine adherence to altruistic principles. Either possibility represents a threat to successful compliance, but they are different categories of threat requiring different response protocols. Meaning? Kalor's patience, never abundant, was approaching its limits. Meaning that if he is strategically employing non-lethality to demoralize our forces while preparing a more devastating attack, we should immediately escalate to exterminatus protocols before his trap springs. But if he genuinely believes in the possibility of peaceful coexistence, if his restraint is not tactical but ethical, then we face an opponent we cannot defeat through conventional compliance actions, because our victory would require us to kill someone who is functionally human in all ways that matter to Imperial doctrine regarding population integration. The bridge fell silent, save for the omnipresent hum of plasma reactors and the distant mechanical prayers of servitors undergoing maintenance that would have qualified as torture if they still possessed sufficient consciousness to understand what was being done to them. Kalor had spent 73 years following doctrine, trusting that the Codex Imperialis contained wisdom distilled from 10,000 years of warfare, that every situation had a doctrinal response that would lead to victory if executed with sufficient faith and force. But doctrine had been written by Primarchs who had never encountered an entity that could withstand cyclonic torpedoes and chose not to retaliate, who could dismantle Astartes and dreadnoughts and deliberately pulled his punches, who offered negotiation after demonstrating the capacity to win through violence. The Codex had no chapter for this. "Recall all ground forces," Kaelor commanded, his voice carrying none of the usual certainty, just exhaustion and the weight of command, making decisions that would be judged by history and the Inquisition in approximately equal measures. "Establish orbital perimeter. Maintain defensive posture. We will not escalate to full-scale war until I have consulted with higher authority. Lord Solar." Grail's voice carried the edge of someone who could not believe what he was hearing. "We have deployment authorization, compliance mandate, every legal and theological justification for aggressive action. Withdrawing in the face of resistance suggests weakness, invites further defiance." The Codex was written for situations where the outcome was uncertain, Kaelor interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut ceramite. "This situation is not uncertain. If we escalate, we will lose forces we cannot easily replace fighting enemies who are deliberately choosing not to kill us. Our continued survival is contingent on their mercy, and that is not a tactical position from which to press an offensive. We withdraw, we regroup, and we determine whether this world represents a threat that requires annihilation or an asset that requires a different integration approach." It was the first time in anyone's memory that Lord Solar Adrastus Kaelor had ordered a withdrawal before victory was achieved or defeat was mathematically inevitable. It would be noted in records, analyzed by Mechanicus data looms, cited in future doctrine reviews, but it would also save lives, both Imperial and Terran, buying time for strategies beyond immediate violence to be contemplated. On Earth, the recall order propagated through Imperial Vox networks with the efficiency of prayer traveling through a cathedral's architecture. Astartes ceased fire, dreadnoughts powered down weapon systems. Imperial Guard infantry began redeployment sequences that would extract them from forward positions to orbital transport. They retreated in good order, professionally, maintaining defensive formations and covering fire lanes, but they retreated nonetheless, leaving behind empty bases and cratered ground and a planet that had just demonstrated it could defend itself against forces that had conquered galaxies. Superman watched them go from his position above the Montana compound, his enhanced vision tracking the orbital shuttles climbing toward the fleet, counting the soldiers who were leaving alive, who might have died if he had chosen violence over restraint. He did not feel victorious. Victory implied a conflict concluded, objectives achieved, peace secured. This was none of those things. This was a pause, a moment to breathe before the next escalation. A brief respite before doctrine and determination found new ways to justify the unjustifiable. But it was also proof that restraint could work, that mercy could be tactical, that choosing not to kill was sometimes the strongest choice available. He descended slowly toward where Wonder Woman was landing, her lasso coiled at her hip, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just proven a philosophical point through physical demonstration. Around them, Justice League members were converging, each one bearing the marks of conflict, exhaustion evident in postures and expressions, but none bearing the weight of kills they had not wanted to make. They withdrew, Diana observed, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be stated to make it feel real. They came here expecting conquest and left with nothing but bruised pride and damaged equipment. They'll be back. Batman's voice crackled over the communication channel, transmitted from the watchtower where he was already analyzing the fleet's repositioning for tactical implications. This was reconnaissance in force, a probe to test our capabilities and resolve. They've learned we can stop their conventional forces. Next time, they'll bring unconventional responses. Then we'll stop those too, the Flash said, his voice carrying optimism that was either admirable or delusional depending on how cynical one's perspective had become. We've faced alien invasions before, dimensional incursions, time-traveling armies. We always find a way. This time might be different, Superman said quietly, his eyes tracking the fleet hanging in the sky like a promise of greater violence deferred but not forgotten. They're not trying to destroy us, they're trying to save us, at least in their minds. That makes them more dangerous than any enemy we faced, because they'll justify any atrocity as necessary, any cruelty as mercy, any destruction as purification. How do we fight someone who genuinely believes that killing us is for our own good? The question hung in the air, unanswered because there was no good answer. Only the grim understanding that the war that had almost started was still waiting, still inevitable, merely postponed until doctrine and determination found the right combination of force and faith to overcome Earth's resistance. In orbit, the Imperial fleet repositioned itself. Weapons pointed down at a world that had just demonstrated it would not submit easily, soldiers counting their wounds and wondering at an enemy that could have killed them but chose restraint. And in the space between the fleet and the planet, the warp rift continued to bleed impossible colors, a wound that refused to heal, growing incrementally larger with each passing hour, a symptom of damage to reality that both sides were too focused on immediate conflict to properly address. It was the kind of detail that would become critical later, the kind of oversight that would reframe everything that had happened and everything that was coming, the kind of mistake that apocalypses were built upon. But for now, both sides were too occupied with their immediate confrontation to notice that the universe was breaking around them, that something far worse than imperial doctrine or superhuman defenders was preparing to manifest. The sky bled, and no one was watching the wound. They would, soon, when it became impossible to ignore, but by then it would be too late for prevention, and all that would remain was the grim work of trying to survive what they had inadvertently unleashed. The universe had a sense of irony that bordered on cruelty, and it was about to deliver a punchline that would make both sides wish they had been paying better attention. The rift had been growing for 3 days, incremental expansion that went unnoticed amidst the immediate crisis of an imperial fleet establishing orbital siege posture and Earth's governments attempting to coordinate defensive strategies with superheroes whose usual modus operandi involved punching the problem until physics surrendered. But the universe had other plans, plans that cared nothing for human drama or imperial doctrine, plans written in the cold mathematics of dimensional instability and warp space degradation. In the Watchtower, Batman had been the first to notice the anomaly, his paranoia translating into a compulsion to monitor every variable regardless of how tangential it seemed to immediate threats. He had been reviewing sensor logs from the rift's initial appearance, tracking its energy signature over time. When the pattern became evident, the rift was not stable. It was not simply a tear in space-time that had allowed the Imperial fleet to translate from their dimension into Earth's reality. It was growing, expanding at a rate that followed an exponential curve, doubling in diameter every 48 hours, bleeding energies that did not correspond to any physics Batman's considerable intellect could recognize. He had summoned Superman immediately, displaying the holographic analysis with the clinical detachment he employed when delivering bad news, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to function while contemplating apocalyptic scenarios. Superman stared at the rotating display, watching the rift's expansion plotted across a timeline that ended with a projection showing it encompassing Earth's orbit within 6 weeks. What happens if it continues growing? Superman asked, though some part of him already knew the answer would not improve his day. Unknown, Batman replied, which was his way of saying nothing good. The energy readings suggest dimensional instability at a fundamental level. The rift is not simply a hole between realities, it's a degradation of the boundaries that keep realities separate. If it expands sufficiently, we could be looking at wholesale dimension collapse, reality erosion, or the merging of incompatible physical laws. In English, the universe breaks, and we all cease to exist in any meaningful way. Superman absorbed this with the expression of a man who had just learned that his morning coffee was poisoned, his job was terminated, and his house was on fire, all while being informed that his shoes were also untied. So stopping the Imperial invasion is irrelevant if the method of their arrival destroys Earth anyway. Correct. Can we close the rift? Insufficient data. I'd need to send probes into the rift to analyze its internal structure, determine what's causing the degradation, identify potential closure mechanisms. But any probe I send through would be entering a region where conventional physics may not apply, where the laws of causality could be suspended or reversed. We might not get useful data back. We might get data that drives our analysis systems insane by introducing logical paradoxes into their baseline assumptions. Superman was quiet for a long moment, his super hearing tracking the sounds of Earth below. 8 billion people living their lives in blissful ignorance that reality itself was fraying around them, that the sky was not just torn but actively unraveling. "We need to tell them," he said finally. "The Imperium. They caused this, or their arrival did. Maybe they have experience with this kind of dimensional damage, maybe they know how to repair it, or maybe they'll see it as proof that Earth is warp-tainted and requires exterminatus protocols," Batman countered. "Giving them additional reasons to destroy us seems strategically questionable. Alternatively, we're all going to die anyway if that rift isn't closed. So we might as well try cooperation before defaulting to mutual destruction." It was the eternal tension between Batman's paranoia and Superman's hope, played out in miniature over a decision that would affect billions. Bruce saw threats in every shadow because experience had taught him that shadows were where threats lived. Clark saw opportunities for redemption because experience had taught him that sometimes people surprised you by choosing good even when evil was easier. They compromised by deciding to approach the Imperium with the information, but doing so from a position of demonstrated capability, making it clear that cooperation was being offered but not begged for. The communication request was transmitted on the same frequencies that had carried previous negotiations, a simple message requesting urgent dialogue regarding mutual threat assessment. It was phrased carefully, using language that suggested neither weakness nor aggression, walking the narrow line between supplication and ultimatum. The response came within minutes. Lord Solar Kalor's mechanical rasp carrying across the void with the efficiency of a civilization that had perfected long-range communication when Earth's ancestors were still painting caves. "Your request for dialogue is acknowledged. State your concern." Superman took point on the communication, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. "The rift that brought your fleet here is expanding. Our analysis suggests it's not stable, that it's growing exponentially and could pose a threat to Earth within weeks. We need to discuss options for stabilization or closure before it becomes a crisis neither of us can manage." Silence on the other end, lasting long enough that Superman wondered if the communication had been severed. Then Kalor spoke, his voice carrying a new dimension that might have been concern if mechanical rasps could convey emotion. "You have detected rift expansion?" Our tech priests reported similar findings but attributed them to normal warp-storm fluctuation. "You are suggesting this is abnormal?" "We're suggesting it's catastrophic," Batman interjected. "Transmitting the sensor data and analysis through the communication channel. The expansion follows a pattern consistent with dimensional breakdown, not standard warp space activity as we understand it from your previous communications. This isn't a storm. It's a structural collapse." Another pause, this one accompanied by sounds of binary cant and mechanical prayer in the background, tech priests performing emergency analysis on data that challenged their doctrinal understanding of warp space physics. When Kalor spoke again, his voice had lost its certainty, replaced by something that might have been genuine alarm. "If your analysis is accurate, and our preliminary verification suggests it may be, then we are facing a situation that exceeds compliance operations priority. Warp rift expansion of this magnitude could tear the Geller fields that protect our ships, expose our crews to immaterium influence, potentially trigger demonic manifestation on a scale that would threaten both your world and our fleet." "Demonic manifestation?" Wonder Woman's voice carried the tone of someone who had fought actual demons and found the experience unpleasant enough that repeating it ranked low on her list of preferred activities. "Entities from the warp," Kalor explained with the patience of someone lecturing recruits on threats they could not yet comprehend. "Creatures of pure psychic energy that feed on emotion and suffering, that manifest in real space when the barriers between dimensions grow thin. They are not metaphorical evil. They are literal predators that consume souls and corrupt flesh, that turn humans into screaming conduits for powers that should not exist. The Imperium has fought them for 10,000 years, and every victory is temporary because they cannot be truly killed, only banished back to the warp where they wait for the next opportunity to manifest. The Justice League members present in the Watchtower exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their collective concern regarding this new variable being added to an already complicated situation. They had fought demons before, entities from hell dimensions and dark gods who manifested to corrupt and destroy. But those had been localized threats, individual manifestations or small cults that could be countered through heroic intervention. What Kaylor was describing sounded systematic, industrial-scale corruption that treated human populations as resources to be harvested. "Then we have a common enemy," Superman said, forcing optimism into his voice because someone needed to suggest that cooperation was possible. "The rift threatens both our worlds, both our people. We need to work together to close it before it expands to the point where neither of us can prevent catastrophe." Cooperation with Xenos-contaminated populations is typically prohibited by inquisitorial decree, Kaylor replied, his tone suggesting he was reciting doctrine while simultaneously contemplating how much of it could be strategically ignored. However, facing imminent warp breach is an extenuating circumstance that may justify temporary alliance. I will need to consult with the Inquisitorial Observer and my Tech Priest contingent to determine if closure is feasible and what resources would be required. "How long?" Batman asked, already calculating timelines against the rift's expansion rate. 3 hours for preliminary assessment. 6 for detailed analysis if we commit our full Tech Priest complement to the problem. If the Observer determines that cooperation is theologically acceptable, which is not guaranteed. "We don't have time for theology to debate physics." Superman's voice carried an edge that suggested his patience with imperial bureaucracy was approaching its limits. "People are going to die if we don't act. Both are people. Can you make the Observer understand that?" "The Observer understands more than you credit," Kaylor replied. "But her concerns are not immediately practical. She must consider whether cooperation with your world would create precedent that undermines future compliance actions, whether allowing your civilization to persist poses greater long-term risk than the immediate threat of warp breach. These are not simple calculations." "Then we'll make them simple," Diana interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose patience for bureaucratic delay had expired several sentences ago. "You help us close the rift. We'll discuss terms for peaceful coexistence afterward. Or you refuse to help, the rift expands, and we all die together, while your Observer contemplates whether cooperation was theologically pure. Those are your options." It was not diplomacy by any standard that would be taught in negotiation courses, but it had the virtue of clarity, stripping away complexity to reveal the core decision that everything else depended on. Kaylor appreciated clarity. 73 years of military command had taught him to value subordinates who could distill complex situations into actionable choices. This woman, this self-proclaimed princess who could restrain cyclonic torpedoes with a glowing rope and spoke with the certainty of someone who had commanded armies, was offering exactly that. 6 hours, he said. "We will analyze the rift, determine closure feasibility, and present options for coordinated action. During that time, we will maintain ceasefire protocols, and I expect your forces to do the same. No provocations, no aggressive positioning, no actions that could be interpreted as prelude to attack." "Agreed," Superman replied. 6 hours. Then we meet again, compare findings, and determine next steps. The communication ended, leaving the Watchtower in silence, save for the hum of systems and the distant sound of Earth's atmosphere creating drag against the station's hull, even at this altitude. "Do we trust them?" the Flash asked, voicing the question everyone was contemplating. "We verify," Batman replied, already pulling up new sensor configurations, preparing to monitor both the Rift and the Imperial fleet for any indication that cooperation was a ruse masking aggressive intent. "Trust is for people who haven't spent sufficient time contemplating worst-case scenarios. We prepare for betrayal while hoping for cooperation." "That's the most Batman thing you've ever said," Green Lantern observed. "I'm aware." Superman turned from the holographic displays to look at Earth below, the planet that had given him home and purpose, that had taught him to value life and defend the powerless, that had made him into the hero he had chosen to become rather than the god his biology suggested he could have been. If the rift continued to expand, if dimensional collapse occurred as Batman's analysis suggested it might, none of that would matter. All the battles fought, all the lives saved, all the principles upheld would be erased in a cascade of physics that treated hope and doctrine with equal contempt. The universe was indifferent to morality, operated according to laws that cared nothing for justice or mercy. But the people who inhabited that universe could choose to care, could impose meaning and value through sheer force of will and determination. The Imperium thought humanity survived through strength and doctrine. Earth thought humanity thrived through hope and cooperation. Maybe both were true. Maybe survival required strength, and thriving required hope, and the difference between them was the difference between existing and living. In 6 hours, they would discover whether cooperation between these worldviews was possible, or if the gulf between them was as insurmountable as the rift that threatened to consume them both. Superman returned to his monitoring station, his eyes tracking the rift's slow expansion across sensor displays, watching as impossible colors bled further into their reality as the wound in space-time deepened incrementally toward critical threshold. He had 6 hours to prepare for cooperation or conflict, to rest or to plan, to hope or to despair. He chose hope because choosing anything else meant surrendering before the fight had truly begun, and surrender was not in his vocabulary. The universe was breaking, but it had been breaking since the moment it began expanding from a singular point 14 billion years prior. Entropy was the default state of existence. Order was the aberration, the temporary condition that required constant energy and effort to maintain. If fighting entropy required working with an empire that viewed mercy as weakness, so be it. He had done stranger things in service of protecting Earth. The rift continued to grow, patient as geology, inevitable as gravity, indifferent to the drama unfolding around it. It had been waiting for millions of years to manifest, and now that it had found an opportunity, it would not be denied except through comprehension and action that neither side possessed in sufficient quantity. But they would try, because trying was all anyone could ever do. And sometimes, rarely, impossibly, trying was enough.